Good evening. It's Tuesday the 14th of March. Our top stories tonight. Details revealed over how the AUKUS submarine fleet will be built over the next 3 decades. China issues a stinging rebuke accusing the deal of undermining peace and security in the region. And just how will the government fund the $368 billion price tag to pay for this ambitious project? You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverly O'Connor. Well, let's get straight to today's unveiling of the AUKUS submarine deal that upends Australia's defence and budget priorities into the coming 4 decades, and of course its impact on regional security and growing tensions. Let's firstly look at the details of how the new fleet will evolve into the 2060s. The program comes with a price tag of up to $368 billion over the next 30 years. Pending the approval of US Congress, Australia will take 3 American Virginia-class submarines. Now, that'll happen in the early 2030s, with the option to purchase another 2. In the meantime, design and development work will continue on a brand new submarine known as SSN AUKUS, which is based on British designs to replace their Astute-class submarines. It's expected 1 submarine will be built every 2 years from the early 2040s through to the late 2050s. By the 2060s, the fleet is expected to include 8 Australian submarines built in Adelaide. Beijing has reacted strongly to the announcement of the AUKUS plan, urging the US, the UK and Australia to listen to the call of the international community to abandon the nuclear-powered submarine deal so as not to undermine peace and stability in the region.
China has repeatedly stressed that the AUKUS Pact and the 3 countries' efforts to advance cooperation on nuclear submarines and other cutting-edge military technology is typical Cold War mentality. It will only spur an arms race and undermine the international non-proliferation regime and harm regional peace and stability. Peace-loving countries have expressed their serious concern and opposition. The 3 countries' latest joint statement shows that in pursuit of geopolitical selfish interests, they can disregard the international community's concerns and travel further down the dangerous and wrong path. Their cooperation concerns the transfer from nuclear weapon states to non-nuclear weapon states of a large amount of weapons-grade uranium. It constitutes grave nuclear proliferation risks and violates the purposes and objectives in the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Well, it's taken 18 months since the AUKUS Pact between Australia, the UK and the US was first announced to finally learn how our Navy will acquire a new fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. The Albanese government says the investment is crucial to maintaining peace and stability in the Pacific. Our defence correspondent Andrew Green was in San Diego for the announcement.
The Commander-in-Chief giving his allies the full American welcome.
I'm proud to be your shipmates.
With one of his country's prized nuclear submarines, the USS Missouri, docked alongside, the President, flanked by the Prime Ministers, revealed the long-awaited details of their AUKUS deal.
The biggest single investment in Australia's defence capability in all of our history.
From 2027, 1 British Astute-class boat and up to 4 American Virginia-class subs begin regular rotations out of WA. In the early 2030s, Australia will begin buying at least 3 Virginia-class boats from the US, pending congressional approval, with an option to get 2 more if needed. Then, from the 2040s, Australia wants to begin delivering new AUKUS-class submarines built in Adelaide using a British design with an American combat system.
The ultimate goal isn't just selling subs to Australia, it's developing something new together.
One of the most advanced nuclear-powered subs the world has ever known.
In the mid-2050s, all things going to plan, the Royal Australian Navy will have 8 submarines, at least 3 American and 5 Australian-made. The Virginia-class submarines would start being retired in the 2060s, replaced with more of the new AUKUS models. The cost to Australian taxpayers, hard to fathom, between $268 and $368 billion over the next 3 decades. The British Prime Minister pointing to recent history as reason for the monumental military build-up.
Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, China's growing assertiveness, all threaten to create a world defined by danger, disorder and division.
Nuclear submarines considered part of the answer. Faster and more stealthy than conventional subs, able to stay submerged for months on end. But all 3 AUKUS partners are stressing Australia's nuclear-powered subs won't carry nuclear weapons.
Australia's proud record of leadership in the international nuclear non-proliferation regime will of course continue.
And despite the fractious state of US politics, an assurance from the White House's current occupant.
Mr. President, does this survive a change of administration?
For sheer ambition, this project is unrivalled in size and complexity for all 3 leaders. So a lot needs to go right if it's even to run roughly to plan. Joe Biden would be 97, Anthony Albanese 77 and Rishi Sunak almost 60 by the time the first new AUKUS sub is due to be delivered. Their collective leadership will be long past by then.
Can I tell them at ease? I'm their commander-in-chief, right?
Yet their legacy, at least in part, will be shaped on the commitments they made here today. Andrew Green, ABC News, San Diego.
Well, of course, the AUKUS Pact is far more than nuclear-powered submarines. It'll shape many aspects of the Australian economy for decades to come. And as political editor Andrew Probyn explains, the Trilateral Defence Pact will require national priorities to be reconfigured and reprioritised.
AUKUS will be a massive national endeavour that'll have significant challenges on the security and economic fronts. To build nuclear-powered submarines, Australia will need technology, skills and a workforce that don't currently exist. And although initial costs are relatively modest, they will ramp up quickly in the 2030s and beyond.
Australia can't afford not to do this, and this is a key investment.
I want to give this commitment to the Australian people today that come hell or high water, the Coalition will support AUKUS.
Bipartisanship's one thing, but in the context of an ageing population, sizable structural budget deficit and huge cost pressures in aged care, health and the NDIS, something's got to give. Big decisions about spending cuts or higher taxes are inevitable. However, they will take courage and a government's preparedness to spend political capital while standing firm against an assertive superpower and Australia's biggest trading partner, China.
Well, after the AUKUS submarine details became clearer today, attention is now turning to the ultimate risk and reward offered by the agreement. Dr. Beck Starting is the Director of La Trobe Asia, and she joins us now out of Montreal. Beck, lovely to have you with us. We just heard Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer there, saying Australia can't afford not to go down that path. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly audacious plan from the Australian government. It's quite remarkable in the scope and the scale of what they're proposing to do here. And I think that what we see with AUKUS is that there is a bipartisan support for the idea that Australia needs to be playing a much bigger role in the region. And so politicians and members of the Australian strategic elite have really bought into this idea of US-led integrated deterrence, this idea that the US, along with its allies and partners, need to band together collectively to provide a counterweight to China in the Asian region. I guess the issues are, you know, what does nuclear-powered submarines offer that perhaps conventionally powered submarines don't offer? And the Australian politicians and decision makers have decided that they are crucial elements to providing deterrence in the region. It will remain to be seen, though, whether or not we actually get those submarines, because there is a long process ahead of us and a lot of work to be done.
And you know, historically, we've seen one submarine project after the other never really come to fruition. And to your point, this is the most ambitious of them all. Will it come to fruition?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is being described as high risk and potentially high reward. And you're absolutely right. There's the recent track record on Australia's submarine programs doesn't exactly engender a huge amount of faith. And so really, I think what we're going to have to see is a whole of nation approach to try and pull this together. And the messaging has to be right to the domestic audiences, but also to the regional audiences, because, or to other states in the Asian region and in the Pacific as well, because, you know, politicians are going to need to explain to Australian citizens why they want to spend such eye-watering sums of money on this nuclear powered submarine program, and it has to explain to our partners in the region that it aims not to destabilise the region with this plan, but to contribute to regional stability and security. And I don't think that Australia's politicians can just assume that other states in the region will accept those promises on face value. That's the work that diplomats really need to be doing as well.
Yeah, that's such a great point you make. So strategically, how do you think this positions Australia, given those Pacific partners that we need to explain this to other nations in, you know, around the South China Sea, China, of course, being key among them, who we've tried to start thawing relations with?
Well, that's an interesting question, because, you know, there has been efforts by the Labor government to try and find a new normal with China and to try to find a way of reducing some of those trade sanctions that China applied in 2020. I think that the benefit of this particular announcement, though, is that it's no surprise. Like AUKUS, when it was first announced in September 2021, that was the real news then. Whereas now what we're seeing is how that plan is going to come into fruition. But it really, I think it says a lot about Australia's conception of its role for itself. It's moved away from this idea of it being a middle power in a global context towards it being a regional power in an Indo-Pacific concept. And it really reveals some of those enduring traditions that Australia seeks security with its so-called great and powerful friends, the United States and the United Kingdom. But it is imperative that we do not forget about our partners in the region, and that we continue not just to suggest that these submarines are all about deterrence, but we need to be providing reassurance as well to the region.
What is the risk to Australia as you see it if we can't we can't convince our partners, and the potential military risk by positioning ourselves as a middle power here in the region, something that we haven't necessarily demonstrated in recent years?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I'm a bit cautious around this question because there's been a lot of kind of irresponsible reporting in recent weeks about whether or not Australia might be invaded by China and the time span for that kind of scenario. The Red Alert series in the Sydney Morning Herald suggested that we're potentially 3 years away from that kind of scenario. Look, I think there's a key point to be made here. It's not just Australia that's building up its arms. in maritime Asia. This is at least partly driven by China's own, building up of its capabilities as well. There's a risk that we enter what's called a security spiral, where mistrust becomes so sort of defining of the regional security order that it's difficult to break free from that mistrust. So reassurance, I think, is really crucial because we don't want to see Australia getting trapped in a situation where there might be, say, an accidental collision that sparks conflict, or that we're drawn into conflict without fully being prepared to participate in such an event.
Beck, really interesting perspective that you've brought to that. We will watch as this continues to play out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, let's return to the issue of China, where news of the agreement has raised eyebrows, with government officials calling the deal an expensive mistake. The alliance has prompted President Xi Jinping to pledge to turn China's military into a great wall of steel to safeguard his country's sovereignty, security and development interests. Here's our East Asia correspondent, Bill Birtles.
China's government has, for quite a long time now, many months, launched a very vigorous diplomatic campaign against AUKUS. The focus of that is to try and put obstacles in place of the submarine plan at the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, because China, along with its quasi-ally Russia, argues that the AUKUS plan breaches the nuclear non-proliferation rules of the IAEA, even though the agency itself thus far says it's satisfied with the engagement and the consultations that the three AUKUS countries have been carrying out with the IAEA. China not happy with that, trying to rally other members of that body to join it in getting the agency to oppose AUKUS, or to say that it's dissatisfied so far with the consultations. So this still has some time to play out. Obviously, AUKUS is a long-term plan, and it's very likely now that some concrete details have been announced, Ros, that China will only step up its diplomatic efforts, particularly too here in the region in Southeast Asia. Countries like Indonesia have also expressed mixed messages, but some concerns about the nuclear non-proliferation issue. You could probably imagine China will continue to lobby those countries pretty hard. Well, aside from the efforts at the IAEA, there's also been a public lobbying campaign. You've had Chinese officials, you've had state media, on one hand, almost kind of mocking the plan for how long it is going to take and how expensive it will be, but on the other hand, saying that it will very seriously destabilise the region, possibly lead to an arms race, and it is a strategy of the US to contain China. So the warnings from state media that perhaps are directed at Australia are basically saying you're wasting a lot of money, this is going to take too long, and these AUKUS submarines are going to be used primarily for US strategic interests rather than Australia's national interests. That's the public messaging Beijing's been directing at Australia, and then on the other hand there is the messaging that it's doing on the diplomatic front involving the Nuclear Regulation Agency.
At home, politicians are promising the AUKUS plan will create thousands of new jobs, with the lion's share of them going to South Australia. But under the abandoned French submarine deal, workers would already be cutting steel, while construction of the first AUKUS submarine remains years away.
A new dawn at South Australia's shipyards.
Today's announcement is very good news for the short term in South Australia. It's massive news for the medium term. And in the long term, it's game-changing news for the people of our state.
A $2 billion upgrade will begin at Adelaide's Osborne facility this year, getting ready for construction of nuclear submarines. The submarine program is expected to create more than 8,000 jobs once it reaches its peak. But that's still 2 to 3 decades away, a long wait for local businesses hit by the scrapping of the French sub deal.
Now we're talking about certainty, but that certainty is a decade away.
It's not just South Australia's shipyards getting an upgrade. $8 billion will be spent on Perth's naval base, which will become the west coast home of the nuclear submarines from the 2030s. That port will also be getting more frequent, longer visits from US and British boats.
This is a game changer for our nation, and it's a game changer for Western Australia as well.
While WA's HMAS Stirling base will be the West Coast home, the government is yet to confirm whether Port Kembla in New South Wales will be their home in the east. Wherever they're docked, questions remain about how Australia will handle a new nuclear industry. The federal government says Australia won't supply its own fuel, but it does have a responsibility to store it once it's spent.
So obviously that facility will be remote from populations, and today we are announcing that that facility will be on defence land, current or future.
A waste storage facility is unlikely to be needed for decades because the submarines have long-lasting, sealed nuclear reactors. But given the history of attempts to establish nuclear waste dumps in remote Australia, it's likely to be a politically fraught decision for whichever government has to make it. Leah McLennan, ABC News, Adelaide.
Well, while today's announcement has been met with much fanfare in the US and among AUKUS's leaders, not everyone is confident these submarines will ever be delivered. International editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Harter, says the federal government will need to justify the massive price tag given current domestic challenges.
It's a difficult sell, I would suspect, Bev, because you're instantly going to have a lot of people comparing those huge dollar sums with the deficits in other areas of spending. We all know that there is a countrywide hospital shortage of staff, shortage of beds. We all know that the NDIS is running short of funding or being oversubscribed at least. So a lot of people will want to know why we can spend these astronomical sounding sums on exotic sounding submarines but not tend to basic community needs.
There's the scale of the price tag. There's also the time frame and the history of submarine building and development in Australia. How do you think this stacks up? It's a far more adventurous proposition.
Yes, it is. It's more adventurous than any of Australia's other recent episodes of a traditional game now in Australia that I like to call fantasy subs. It was 2014 when it was 2009 when the Labor Party first proposed 12 new submarines to replace the Collins class. They were colloquially known as Son of Collins. They were a fantasy. Then we had from Tony Abbott Japanese-built submarines. They turned out to be a fantasy replaced by Malcolm Turnbull's French submarines, which were dumped in turn by Scott Morrison in favour of the AUKUS proposal, which has now been brought to fruition by Anthony Albanese, or at least the plan for which has been brought to fruition. Yet this is absolutely an exotic and long-range plan. For the first decade of this plan, phase one is essentially just more US port visits and then UK port visits from their nuclear-powered and in some cases nuclear-armed submarines through Australia. The second decade is when Australia simply buys between 3 and 5 Virginia-class submarines from the US. It's only when you get into the third decade that Australia and Britain start to bring off the production line, or start to make on the production line, the new so-called SSN AUKUS submarines. They'll be a completely new design based on a British model. They'll be jointly manufactured by the Brits and Australia, and they'll start rolling off the production line in the 2040s. So even then, Australia will not have, and by that point, the existing Collins-class subs will be progressively retired. So even then, Australia will not have a credible number of capable nuclear or any submarines in the water. If you have 3, which is the second decade in this plan, when we have the 3 Virginia-class subs bought from the US, under the rule of 3 on any military deployment, only 1/3 of those can be on active deployment at any one time. 1 is in maintenance, the 3rd is being brought out of maintenance. So even if we have 3 American Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines, it means only one can be deployed at any one time. This is not a credible capability, so it's still a very long way off having a serious capability in the water, Bev.
So then, as a deterrent, which we know this really is for China's aggression in the region, is it the right military deterrent in the age that we are now managing these tensions?
Well, the hard calculus that is not spoken by any of the governments here, Bev, is that it would give Australia the ability to put a submarine, because the nuclear-powered subs can stay underwater for up to 3 months, and they have long range, high speed. They're able to linger off the Chinese coast and directly threaten China with the threat of cruise missile strikes, not nuclear missile. Australia's not seeking nuclear weapons, of course. Australia has no capacity at the moment to put China under direct threat, so that's the logic of this particular acquisition. But the time frame on it means that it's not going to be useful for any near-term crisis. More practical for any near-term crisis is so-called Pillar 2 of AUKUS, and that is the cutting-edge technologies that the three countries have committed to developing together. So that includes quantum computing, quantum communications, hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence. They're more likely to be brought to fruition in the next few years than certainly the submarines.
Yeah, which brings us to this discussion and question mark around the potential loss of sovereignty for Australia with this very close deal with both the US and the UK. Can any nation truly keep its sovereignty while working in any alliance or with an ally?
No, these are questions of degree. You're right, they're not questions of absolutes, because a military alliance is inherently a sharing of sovereignty. Each country contributes something of its sovereignty to improve the combined strength of the two countries together. So that's the essential nature of an alliance. The more tightly that they are dependent on each other, the more each shares some sovereignty of its own with the other. As this AUKUS deal tightens the degree of military dependency of the three countries on each other, it therefore requires more pooling of sovereignty from each. So Australia will become dependent on the Brits, well, initially on the Americans for nuclear reactors and nuclear-powered submarines, and then on the Brits to build the reactors which will be in the so-called SSN AUKUS class submarines. Australia will supply other elements and build and manufacture other elements. It also supplies the geography for a lot of these deployments and basing around the Australian coastline. But all of this, and crewing and all the rest that goes with it, but all of this is some surrender of some sovereignty, including funding, personnel, technology, in the interest of increasing the shared combined sovereignty of, in this case, the three allies together.
Yeah. You know, we've heard quite strong rhetoric, if we want to call it that, at this point from Xi Jinping during the People's Congress. He's now head of the military. Should we be believing that this is going to be a deterrent? Is it going to give China pause for thought with its ambitions?
In itself, the particulars of this submarine deal, no, not really. I don't think the concept of a jointly Australian-British manufactured submarine being delivered from the early 2040s on will deter any Chinese adventurism next year or the year after, no. I think, however, it does indicate a couple of things which complicate China's thinking and any plans it might have for aggression or adventurism. One of those is it's an indicator of shared political will to have the three leaders of the three countries committing to a deal which was first announced by a different British Prime Minister and a different Australian Prime Minister, and that is now being advanced to the next stage by new administrations. This suggests some durability and it suggests some seriousness. I think one of the things that surprised well, just about the entire planet with the Ukraine war and Russia's invasion was the surprising purposefulness and speed with which the West came together, the NATO alliance and others, came together to support Ukraine. And I think the AUKUS alliance gives a pretty strong hint that you would see something similar from those allies in the event of Chinese adventurism in the region. But it also, by combining the research capabilities for those cutting-edge so-called second pillar AUKUS capabilities, does suggest a real potential for outmatched technology against China in those areas of military technology.
Always good to get you on. Thanks, Peter, so much.
Pleasure, Bev.